Okay, welcome back. It is late October, 1867, and yeah, time for the kind of third quarterly report of the year. It's been a pretty good year so far, albeit a bit of good summer, especially for the economy. I'd start off with the economy because there was a little bit of kind of disquiet and concern after the Austrian War. Now, during the Austrian War, we had domestic market sales sitting at something like about 1,200 million or whatever its units of. This dropped down to about 8 or 9, as expected, because of course we, after peace, we lost all these territories. We were no longer selling goods or services in what is the area administered by the Austrian Empire. But then after that, after about sort of 2 months, there was a drop off of about 200 units, and I couldn't really figure out why. I'm still kind of scratching my head as to why. But the main thing is that domestic market sales are kind of stabilized around 600-700, and gradually beginning to increase now, sort of between sort of 650 and 800. I think it might have been the initial kind of boon after the end of the war. It could be for a whole host of reasons. It might have just been that there were a lot of commodities kind of left over in the economy that we might have got from the Austrian Empire. So, for example, from their crafts production of agricultural produce, these kind of things. The availability of those goods in the economy might have depressed prices a little bit, and those goods kind of shifted, and eventually we kind of reached an equilibrium where domestic market sales kind of plateaued. But there is a gradual increase now showing a kind of healthy growth in the economy. But the really exciting area is where exports are really picking up in a sustained fashion. Exports now, we almost make, the capitalists in the Ottoman Empire, if you like, the kind of, the 1%, the elite in the Ottoman Empire, almost make as much private capital through exports as they do domestic market sales. That has happened before, but in fits and bursts. But it's fairly sustained now. And if we look at kind of assets balance, there's certain areas that I didn't even expect. This wasn't even a planned kind of planned part of our economy. Of course, it's not really a planned economy, but it's sort of, for example, dyes. So dyes, we are the world's biggest exporter of dyes. We tend to switch places occasionally with Britain, but Britain has a huge trans-global empire, much bigger than the territory that we hold. So it's quite astonishing that we're even second, really. But so we're one of the biggest exporters of dyes on Earth. We also are the biggest exporter of textiles, and that's fairly consistent. And that includes, for example, Parana, which is pretty much an export region for like huge parts of South America. North Germany being kind of third. So even though we manufacture a huge amount of textiles, we have a lot of dyes left over that we export. A lot of that, I think, is kind of incidental to the fact that when we developed our railroad system into the Middle East, it was kind of fairly obvious and natural that we would pursue the coastal road of the Levant, or the coastal kind of path of the Levant. This is the kind of so-called Omar Pasha line that we kind of named in honor of the great general. And this just happens to be the area where most of our dye quarries are. And we did consciously, once we realized that there was a market for that, and these things were always exporting, we did increase our capacity to produce dyes, and that's really, really paid off. So dyes probably generates more money for our economy than tobacco, and tobacco was a really conscious early part of our development. So yeah, really, really good. We've got sort of textiles, dyes, tobacco. We sit at around 4th place, which doesn't sound great, but if you've got to remember that tobacco wasn't massively available in the Ottoman Empire. It was always going to be much more available in like North America, Latin America, the West Indies, and this sort of thing. The real basis for like kind of Turkish tobacco was not really its kind of its availability, its quantity, or its affordability. It was because it had a really distinctive characteristics. That, in a weird way, is kind of mapped in the game. So if we look at tobacco, even though we kind of sit at 4th place. In terms of demand for Ottoman tobacco, it sits at 2nd. You can see the 49, so there's a huge amount of demand. That's probably set on the basis of the fact that the West Mediterranean, or the East Mediterranean, I should say, in fact it's just the Mediterranean trade box, probably has more merchant access than maybe the West Indies. Like more kind of developed powers are likely to have more kind of trade ships in the Mediterranean than they are the West Indies, unless they happen to be a colonial power in the West Indies, like Britain or France or Holland. But in real life, Turkish tobacco was, it was grown in kind of southern Europe, in the Balkan regions. But Turkish tobacco, or Oriental tobacco, in its natural state, is very light, very creamy, very low in nicotine, slightly less carcinogenic than other kinds of tobaccos. It still is carcinogenic, of course, but it has really distinctive qualities. But these kinds of things were not very fashionable in the 19th century. So what the Ottomans did, because they wanted to consciously export tobacco, is they shipped the tobacco all the way from the kind of Balkan provinces to Latakia, to this region here. And they treated the tobacco. They used to hang the tobacco in nets, and they treated it by burning, I think it's local spruce leaves or something like this. It's a sort of bit of a secret recipe, but they treated the tobacco and gave it a really tarry, rich kind of quality, which is very, very distinctive and unlike anything. I mean, even heavily treated American tobaccos like Perique don't quite cut it. I mean, they probably have much more nicotine than Perique, but so I'm a bit of a tobacco buff, hence why I'm kind of rambling about this, but yeah, it has a really distinctive kind of quality to it, and it was really fashionable in Britain. Less fashionable in places like Denmark and Germany, where sweet tobaccos were much more sort of fashionable. But in Britain, Latakia tobacco, or Balkan or Oriental tobacco, was very fashionable, to the extent that Latakia tobacco now in North America is referred to as English tobacco, even though, of course, it's not grown in England, wasn't even grown in the British Empire, but it's so yeah, a little bit of novel history there that sort of dovetails strangely with the kind of game situation in the late 1860s. But tobacco were really well established, and a lot of other things. For example, coal. We invested a lot into kind of upgrading our coal mining capacity. It's hugely increased the yield of coal production, and we have a huge surplus of coal now that we're able to export. We actually sit currently at second. I mean, that won't necessarily be a consistent thing, but we do have a lot of coal that we're happy to dump onto the international market. Germany's still first, France after us, and at the moment Britain doesn't seem to be exporting coal. We might be stockpiling for certain kind of planned spending, but we've really kind of established ourselves as a significant industrial power. A lot of other things also, for example, we just recently finished the construction of our second mechanical shops. We produce small kind of mechanical parts and machines. The main draw for this is coal mines. The mechanization of coal mine production creates a demand for this, which we were importing. We're now self-sufficient. We don't have enough that we can export, but we're self-sufficient in terms of mechanical parts. And we're in the process of increasing our steel productive capacity. We do produce a surplus, but it's a very sort of modest surplus. And the thing is with steel is whenever we want to introduce a new stretch of rail line, our economy is very thirsty for steel. Economic growth that requires any kind of serious amount of industrial plant or railways consumes a huge amount of steel. So we want a capacity to stockpile steel very readily. And in the event that we have a huge stockpile of steel, there's always the option, like coal, to steal on the export market and make some free money, basically. So we're looking to drive that up also. But yeah, we really kind of established ourselves, by the late 1860s, 17 years into the game, as a credible industrial power. But in some fields like dyes, we're actually leading the way. In terms of luxury goods, we're actually the only power on earth that exports luxury goods at the moment. And we establish ourselves very consciously as a kind of luxury goods kind of power. And now luxury goods, we've actually got 2 luxury goods shops in construction at the moment in Smyrna. This means that we'll bring our luxury goods shop to about 6 or 7. Luxury goods is a way of repurposing manufactured goods into something that has a much higher value. So like an example in the modern era would be something like suits, like Italian suits, for example. So Italian suits often might be imported from Southeast Asia by a company like Versace or D&G, whoever, and they might do some small amount of tailoring to the suit, and then that suit could be sold at a much higher much higher price than a suit that's just mass produced in Southeast Asia, because it's an Italian suit. So it's basically adding value to sort of fairly generic manufactured goods, by, I suppose, appealing to a degree of sort of commodity fetishism and this sort of thing. So yeah, really, really, really good quarter economically, and because there's no kind of sort of sustained warfare or anything like this, it's kind of good actually to play the game and to focus on things like this, because this gives us some cues in terms of what to do in the next period with regard to our industrial development. Our main area of investment in the last period has not even been in the kind of hinterlands of the Austrian Empire. We have invested in some things like increasing our luxury goods capacity, laying sort of, we've continued the construction of a steel furnace in Sinop, and then completed the construction of a mechanical goods shop in Salonika. But the main area for private investment in the last period has been in the Arabian Peninsula, the very base of the Arabian Peninsula, the newly acquired kind of, it's not a colony yet, but it's very soon to be, and we don't need to wait for Aden to become a formal colony for us to exploit this region. This is a region that will now start paying for itself in spades because of course we've got huge amounts of access to coffee, opium, and with the rail line. I mean, the rail line in the Hejaz now goes as far south as Aba. So pretty much the entire Hejaz now has a rail line running down it. And the remainder of this line will go through Sana, 45 days. Then Taiz, 135 days. The last stretch then is 225 days, would link up Aden. I mean, amazing to think in the Indian, the Indian Ocean, the West Indian Ocean, all the way up to Sarajevo, you can catch a train in the Ottoman Empire. So the Orient Express, long before its time and much larger than it was. But in addition to that kind of strategic line, we've also extended the line east into Makula with a view to exploit the opium plantation that's being built there. And we're also going to be looking to, for some reason we can't at the moment, and I can't figure out why, we can't exploit Sana or Hodeidah. And I've looked at all kinds of things. It might just be that we'll be able to do that once it becomes a formal colony. Which is not far off, and we're currently in the process of a military, a pacification kind of campaign. We've got 3 turns left, and it's basically 6 weeks. That brings Aden itself, it's 49% CP at the moment. That brings it up to about 51, 52, with the provincial areas of the colony sitting at an average above 40. That makes this region basically ripe for colonization. That brings us over the threshold for formal colonization. It's going to be big. This region is going to be very resource rich, and it's amazing to think, again, with the kind of sustained warfare in the Balkan Peninsula, it's easy to forget how important this region has been for us, really. I mean, the first real kind of, how far we've come as well. The first real crisis of the game was the kind of Aden crisis in like 51, 52, and it was the first real security crisis we had, because we had, if you recall, it was some time ago now in real life, about 7 months ago, we had a trap division. I think it was in Sana, and it was looking like we were going to be losing about 12, 13,000 men, and we've had consistent security issue here, and it's required a lot of time and effort to pacify the region, and it's now an area that is on the cusp of being brought into sort of formal colonial status. So it's pretty exciting, and yeah, we're looking to exploit the region systematically. For some reason, I will see if it's changed now. Coffee, yeah, you see coffee. Even though there is a coffee roundel in Sana, we cannot, for some reason, build a coffee field there. I don't know why. It's the same also with Hodeidah, with opium. Now, for example, we have the capital, we have all the ingredients that we need, but we just cannot play it. I don't think it's a bug. I think there is a reason. It might just be that there's a limited number of RGOs that we could develop in a particular colonial region. I'm not sure. I don't know. Actually, I think I know what it is. Okay, yeah. Collection points. Literally, as I'm kind of going through my mind. Okay, so we need to put a collection point in Sana. That's okay. We can do that fairly. We might be able to do that. No, we can't do it yet because state revenue is fairly sort of slim. So, but anyway, yeah, so pretty good times. I mean, we're still some way away from getting the Hejaz. The main difficulty with the Hejaz is the low level of colonial penetration in the provincial regions. We're still aiming for 1870, which is a pretty good date. We need an average of 40% colonial penetration, and we got 40%, for example, in Yanbu, but in like Hijaz, which is the tile Hijaz, not the overall region, with 35 in Tabuk. In Makar, 40% of Makar. The point is, we don't have any. If one of these regions was like 52 or 45, it would kind of bring the average up, but they're all either at 40 or less, so the average has to be 40, so we're just not there. In the capital area, Medina, we're at 55, which is good. So, and the only thing that we can play is military pacification, so it requires us to have military forces in place to play this card. It's a long card that's expensive and only increases penetration by about 2% a go. The Western Europeans have lots more kind of tools in the box for this, but we have fairly limited, more traditional means to lift colonial penetration. So we kind of have to use those, and it's time consuming. Luckily, there's no competitor in the Hejaz. It's not going anywhere else. It's a protectorate. It just means that it is going to take time. I'm hoping that we can get it done. It might be a bit ambitious now looking at it. We're at the point where it's like going to be 2 years and 3 months or something. I don't think we can do it in that time, but Aden definitely. The other kind of areas of interest, I mean, economically, that's pretty much it. One thing that might be impacting exports economically is a couple of kind of the main kind of international development I'm thinking of is the United States has gone towards Spain and has invaded Cuba, and likely with that also, there's no kind of Spanish, there's no Spanish commerce ships in the Gulf of Mexico. There might be down here though. No, so Spanish commerce has basically been kind of sunk or has sort of fled back to Spain for repairs. That isolates this region, which means that Spain... The reason I actually clocked this is because I was looking at exports one time, and we were exporting like 5 or 6 units of tobacco to Spain, and I thought, why have all powers Spain be importing tobacco? So I checked in their West Indian possessions, and lo and behold, the Americans have actually, got a foothold in Cuba. This has happened many years before it did in real life. Of course, the real Spanish-American War was 1899, and was pretty much, easy money for the Americans, I think, by then. And Spain was a very kind of decayed kind of European colonial power by this time. But I mean, even now in the 1860s, there's not much that Spain can do. Spain's a really good power to play, by the way, if anyone's interested in the first campaign. It has a few colonial possessions, which makes it quite interesting. And if you play your cards right, you can defend the West Indies fairly readily, at least at this time, against the Americans. So we'll see what happens. But I mean, anything that's produced in the West Indies, Spain can't get back to Spain, so it can't export tobacco, really. And America obviously occupies half of Cuba as well. That might have a bit of an impact on tobacco exports, probably creates a bit more demand. If more powers are likely to have merchant fleets in the Western Med, for example, or just the Med, that will increase demand, which might drive up price slightly. So it's it could be that. Now the other kind of interesting kind of international developments is the Chinese Civil War is over, and that's been raging since like 54, 53. I mean, that doesn't have any big ramifications for us really, but it's interesting nonetheless. It creates a little bit of stability. And we do have a long-term interest in both Japan and China. If we can get, Japan especially is a power that's going to start rapidly developing in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. And if we can kind of make something out of that, that'd be really good. But also getting China, for example, dependent on imports from us for manufactured goods would be amazing. It'd create, it's not like that, it's not like there's a real problem for shifting goods at the moment, but at a certain point, our economy is going to outgrow international demand for exports. And I feel like we're the China of the 1860s when I think about China today. Rapidly growing, huge export market, but it'd be really, really good if a very backward, poor China with, 1 billion or 2 billion mouths to feed, or however many, hundreds of millions live there, become dependent on us for things like textiles, tobacco, all kinds of commodities, that we could shift there. It could be really, really good. So we'll keep an eye on that. One thing that we have done ourselves is we're starting to cut the strings a little bit with Britain and France. It's very tentative moves. We certainly don't want any kind of wars with Britain and France in the short term anyway. But we've, for example, long term provided both Britain and France with military access. We've ended military access for the British. They still, I believe, have rights to dock their ships. We'll double check that. They should still have kind of ship docking rights. So they can basically supply their ships in port. But one of the reasons for this, we haven't ended it with France yet, but we're going to. One of the reasons for that is that I've just noticed that large numbers of their forces in peacetime were in Ottoman territory. We're not a colony of theirs. And also they have supply rights, which it doesn't cost us a lot. But, long term, we've had French forces, for example, being supplied by us, presumably, in either Tripolitania or Cyrenaica. These are very modest French forces, but these supplies have to be produced in our factories, moved across the Mediterranean in our merchant ships, landed in Tripoli, and then, it's food and clothing being given to kind of French soldiers. And they kind of think, well, they're not an ally. Neither of them were really allies with us in a war against Austria. Okay, Britain was also in a war with Austria, but that was merely incidental. If Austria declared war on us now, neither Britain or France would declare war on Austria, I suspect. Britain is actually already at war with Austria. But Russia, for example, none of them have provided us with a kind of guarantee for our security or anything like that. And I also feel like we're not the Ottoman Empire of the 1850. We've taken Vienna, twice now, and absolutely devastated the Austrian Empire in the last war. So I don't feel like we're dependent on Britain and France for our security. Furthermore, and I touched upon this in the last video, we could be possibly setting ourselves up as a colonial competitor of the French in, for example, places like Tunisia, Djibouti, and what would become French Indochina, which is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if, a prospective colonial competitor should really have huge numbers of troops based on our soil. I wouldn't mind if they were an ally in a war, and I don't mind if it's one or two kind of, one or two sort of units, but at a certain point, you kind of think, there's a large British army sat in Sarajevo for more than a year, and it's basically drawing supply from our infantry, and I think that's, I know it's the AI, but I don't really want to do that. And we don't need Britain for our security anymore. I think we would even be able to handle our own in a war against. I mean, Britain would be a struggle, but France, I think we would certainly be able to now, So, to that end, we want to maintain good relations with these powers, but we don't really, we don't need to kind of grovel, I think, for their kind of, for good relations with them anymore. Neither of them have a casus belli against us. That would probably end if we managed to get protectorate status for Tunisia, Djibouti, or possibly one of the regions of sort of French Indochina, such as, I'm thinking kind of Hanoi or Saigon. It's a good chance that both Hanoi and Saigon are French objectives, if you like, which is to say they would have a casus belli against us if we control those regions in a formal fashion. So food for thought there, food for thought. It is kind of tempting to just kind of throw caution to the wind and to say, yeah, what the hell, sod the French, we'll just take Tunisia. But then we have to live with those ramifications. And it's not a game that lasts like 2 or 3 days. We're going to be playing it for years. And if we get completely devastated in a campaign and a war where we're completely tied up with Russia and Austria simultaneously, and France lands an army of 100,000 men in Smyrna, sort of not much we could do about that. We don't want to have to live with ramifications. And I mean, like we could lose a lot just to get Tunisia, and what's Tunisia in the last analysis? There's not much there really. But we'll certainly think about it. And also the French might have sort of, they're going to have kind of casus bellis against various other powers like Italy, for example. On the subject of Italy, yeah, it's hard to save them from themselves, I mean, like, Austria has managed to rally a little bit, has managed to scratch together enough forces to recover at least its domestic security, and also to make serious moves in Italy again, which is just bewildering, how the Italians have dropped the ball. I think at this point, Rome might actually be the capital of Italy, or Piedmont Sardinia as it's still called, so I don't think this is quite as devastating as it looks, but I mean, they control the industrial north, for Christ's sake, pretty much entirely, and they've taken those cities properly as well. And yeah, so Italy, I mean, I was pretty convinced only 3 months ago that Italy was an established fact. I think it probably still is. One of the reasons being is that when Austria controlled southern Italy, it merely militarily occupied it, in the same fashion as we merely militarily occupied the Austrian Empire this time last year, or a year and a half ago, however long ago it was. We didn't properly control those regions. That was the case. So, for example, the papacy still existed as a kind of political institution, as did, for example, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. They were just merely militarily occupied. And Austria, I don't believe, had territorial claims on these regions. As such, Austria couldn't annex these regions. It could kind of get some kind of concession, like reparations, demobilization, whatever, but it couldn't get much more than that, frankly, from these regions. Now, these regions are essentially subsumed into Piedmont Sardinia during the process of unification, which is to say that these regions are now Italian, but merely militarily occupied by Austria. And I think the same applies. I think Austria, for example, has a claim on Milan, which I think for a period of time was controlled by Piedmont Sardinia, and some parts of northern Italy, Austria does have a kind of claim on, but it doesn't have a claim on the entire peninsula. So its options are, it can pretty much do to Italy what it did to the various Italian states, which is just to militarily occupy the entire region for a longer period of time. I think it would be harder for them to do that with Piedmont Sardinia, because Piedmont Sardinia is a more credible political force that has complex foreign relations with factions like France and this sort of thing. So I think probably they'd have to cut a peace deal with them at some point. It might be a peace which, compels Italy to pay reparations or cede a couple of territories, maybe like Parma or something like this, Parma, Bologna or Romagna. So we'll see what happens there. But yeah, Austria has recovered a little bit as a credible military force. It definitely isn't what it was, but it has a smattering of units kind of around our border, but absolutely nothing to be worried about as far as I'm concerned. One thing that we have done in the last 3 months is one thing I noticed when looking at the kind of regional census is for the first time since the 1850s, we've got a little bit of a regional disturbance, just demonstrations in Thracia, which is Kavala, part of northern Greece. Now, the ethnic composition of this region is for the most part Turkish, 23% Greek, 54% Orthodox. I don't know if that little bit that's behind it. One thing that is the case is that we haven't had a garrison there, any kind of military force. So what I've started doing is investing a fairly large amount of our state revenue. At one point we had about 250 state revenue. So I've invested most of that in building small garrison forces, permanently static forces, of a very modest size, about 3,200 men, that just function as a standing garrison in these regions to provide a little bit of kind of security. We've also done it in small or modest kind of cities in Western Anatolia, so places like Izmit, places that are not fortified and have some smattering of industry. Eskişehir, for example, Zonguldak and Tekin, these kinds of places we've built small garrison forces. These are very cheap units, but obviously combined, this does amount to something. And the reason being is in these regional areas, we want to make sure that in the event of there being a kind of localized revolt, or for example, if demonstrations get out of control and they become riots or something like this, we always have a small domestic police force that in the first place functions as a deterrent. It suppresses revolt risk. It makes things like demonstrations and riots far less likely because they can supplement local police. But in the event that you have any kind of serious outbreak, the important infrastructure, the city limits, the towns, the factories, are protected by a small security force of a few thousand men that can provide us with time for regular army units to be moved in. So we're being a little bit conscious now. We're a more serious industrial power. We shouldn't be completely terrified of our own kind of working class or anything like that, but certainly also certain kind of technologies on the horizon, trade unionism, anarchism, things like the Paris Commune. We have to be a little bit more wary of kind of not just kind of external threats like Austria, Russia, Italy, if it ever actually forms, but also some internal threats also. And we have to take kind of measures to ensure that the really important areas of the empire, the industrialized areas, the heartland, if you like, of our empire, which is kind of this really kind of, you zoom out, this kind of region here, that we always have substantial domestic security in place to ensure that these regions can be held. That is kind of it, really, I think, for sort of domestic stuff. I'm trying to think of anything else to report on. The other thing is Somalia. Now, I mentioned already that we've landed a couple of Marine forces, the 4th and 1st Marine Brigades, as a permanent security force of the Somali coast. We did actually have an engagement just north of Mogadishu, Habayo, which went a little bit south, actually. Our Marine force was given a bit of a drubbing. It fell south. We instantly released the other Marine brigades. So we essentially played do-si-do with these Marine brigades, moved them back around. It was a kind of momentary bit of good luck. Nothing too crazy. We lost a couple of hundred casualties, but our Marine brigade was kind of sent reeling. And I just realised the Italians are playing a colonial card there. But in any case, it was short-lived. The Somali tribes themselves suffered casualties, which they'd be hard-pressed to sort of replace. And it looks like they've fallen north and they're out of use. So they're probably in Berbera or somewhere like this. We are continuing to develop the infrastructure around Mogadishu. And this is going to become the kind of project that really replaces Aden as a security project. So the security forces, we're going to keep a permanent force in Aden. It's going to be a bit like Tripoli. It's going to be a division-sized force. So it's going to be sort of 12,000, 13,000 men, and that'll be permanently in place. These other smaller forces, say smaller forces, they're actually division. We've got a division-sized force in Sana'a, and also a cavalry division with some like artillery supplies in Hodeidah. These forces can be released. We'll probably send one of these forces north into Hejaz. One of these forces, I think we're going to make a landing probably in Massawa, because Eritrea is also an area that we're beginning to develop a bit of a security operation. So we released a militia brigade. This is a militia brigade that was initially constructed during the Austrian War, just really for town occupation. A lot of those we decommissioned or demobilized. One or two of them we kept in place, precisely for operations like this. It's not really a marine operation as such, but just a security operation, landing the force. Because they're not Marines, they lose a lot of organization when they land. We landed at Massawa, unbeknownst to us. there are actually now these aren't even a faction; they're just brigands, but they're inside the town and they're being besieged. It looks like they're brigands that have taken some losses, but so we're essentially besieging Lasara at the moment because these forces are a bit more substantial than I had imagined. We're releasing additional forces. So, for example, we've sent a light cavalry brigade with some supply wagons to supplement this force, and probably soonish we might land. I think we'll probably land the infantry division that's currently in Sana, probably in Massawa, and then we'll look to conduct an assault on the fortress. But yeah, we're going to try and clear the Somali coastline, build colonial forts, begin to develop some infrastructure in Massawa itself in the province. So I'm thinking of things like, an anchorage, some depots, things like this. Begin to develop the necessary apparatus to support a kind of security force that can hold this region long term and allow us to economically exploit it and really bring it into kind of protectorate status. So I think between now and 75, if we can get Eritrea and Somalia into protectorate status, that'll be a step in the right direction. Zanzibar is our first ahistorical colony of sorts. It's not yet a formal colony. It's a protectorate. We're currently in the process of playing a pacification card. That should bring it up to 49%, not quite enough of formal colonial status, but there's a good chance that we could bring Zanzibar into the fold as a formal colony by 1870. We have 2 opium plantations in Zanzibar, and Zanzibar is reasonably populous. It's a fairly densely populated region. So we're going to probably try and build up the anchorage. It's currently a coaling station. We're going to turn this into a full-sized harbour, develop railroads here, and turn this into a serious kind of opium growing operation, basically. That, combined with the opium that we're developing in the opium kind of plantations that we're developing in Aden, along with those regions that we're not even exploiting yet, that will put us on the map as a serious opium exporter and coffee exporter within the next 5 years, which will be quite interesting. So, yeah, lots of stuff going on. I mean, one thing we're going to look to do also is, I think, develop railroads. The main problem we have with the kind of Persian Gulf states is it's a very sparsely populated region. So it's all very well that we build things like, diamond mines and this sort of thing, but there's no one there to really work them. So we need to kind of invest a lot more, I think. These areas are formal colonies, but I'm thinking of laying railroads, building up these kind of anchorage, these harbours into more substantial harbours, maybe even develop a bit of a military base here. And that might function to sort of draw in kind of settlers into the region, which we can then kind of put to work in the diamond mines. But this is going to be an area that we kind of focus on fairly significant economic development, I think. It's going to be an area that's going to be quite expensive to develop because it's just wasteland. It's desert, basically. That does make it expensive. The terrain that you build railroads in, for example, the cost, both in terms of the financial cost, but also the raw materials it requires, it is a little bit dependent on kind of, the nature of the terrain. So it's very expensive, for example, to build railroads through mountains and this sort of thing. In terms also of our state revenue, we haven't been able to do too much, precisely because most of our state revenue is either spent on maintaining our army. Now, to be fair, we could afford a much bigger army than we currently have, and we do intend to increase the size of our army, probably by introducing another entire field command within the next couple of years. But at the moment, we're holding back. The reason being is most state revenue that we generate through tax collections or diamond conversion is spent on research and development, and quite intentionally so. We are still a backward power. I'm scrolling in the wrong direction. Let's scroll up. We've currently got 4 slots that receive permanent investment of 50 million, I guess, 50 million pounds per term. So that's 200 million pounds per fortnight is ploughed into research and development. Principally still focusing on the army. We did have a 5th slot that we opened for the navy. We had to drop that. The navy is going to become a focus in the next few years, but we wanted to get a few of these over the line. We tend to focus kind of research and development on theoretical developments that can yield concrete things in the field. So, for example, breech-loading rifles, which we managed to get out. We're now focusing on muzzle-loaded muzzle-loaded artillery, which is going to be probably done within a month. That'll move straight over into iron breech-loaded artillery. But also an economic slot or extraction processing is going to be important for coal mining, iron mining, diamond mines. If we can upgrade our diamond mines And bear in mind, we've got access to a lot of diamonds. I mean, we've got access to diamonds in Kuwait. Kuwait is the only diamond mine that has railroad access and basically enough people there to, fully staff the mines. That gives us an output of 4 per turn. If we could upgrade a diamond mine, or gem field or whatever it's called, I mean, we could sort of, we could be looking at sort of 12, 15 units per turn from just one field. That'd be really, really good. If we did that in all of these areas, for example, in the Gulf states, we would. I mean, God, the amount of wealth that would generate. I mean, if it was all put into conversion, it would be crazy. It would have really high levels of inflation. But we could put a large amount of it into sort of conversion, but also just sell it on the domestic market as a commodity like any other, but a commodity that yields a huge amount of private capital. This is quite. It is an economic slot, but it's one that we're really interested in. It's practical application of theoretical engineering research. Basically, it yields something once it's researched almost instantly. They're the things we're going to focus on. Military staff system and professionalism are a couple of army slots that will have kind of concrete benefits. It will supplement the other things. It's really easy with the army just to focus on things like sticking out a new service rifle and not focusing on the other things that provide unit specialization and things like that, which pad our army out and give it, like a bit more clout. Once professionalism and military staff system are done, that's it for the army, probably for the next decade, maybe the next 15, 20 years. Those 2 slots are probably going to go over to the Navy, or at least one slot is, and we're going to try and maintain 2 naval slots between probably now and say like 1880. That's going to make up our short term. In the short term, that's going to make up our kind of shortfall, if you like, our backwardness with regard to the Navy. We've managed to get out our first kind of ironclads, very, very early kind of ironclad ships. We're going to be focusing research and development on iron ships, also steam ship of the line, and looking at developing the Navy. Between now and sort of 75, 1880, something like that, we're probably going to have to drop one of these slots. Iron muzzle-loaded artillery. So I don't know why I want to say rifle there. We'll go over straight into steel, iron breech-loaded. Then it will eventually be steel breech-loaded. I think probably ore extraction processing. That's 95. Once that's done, we'll drop that line for the time being, because we do now want to have. We don't want to just be breaking even, really. We basically only make tax money. We only make money during the kind of quarterly tax collection. So every kind of 2-3 months, we get a tax collection. It sort of tops us up, and then we spend it. But we want to have a bit more than that. I mean, we're going to need a lot of tax revenue to, sort of transition regions into full colonial status. But also, some of the colonial cards that we want to play require state revenue. So it's good that we're plowing a lot of money into research and development. But I think we're going to drop 1 line. We'll maintain 3 lines permanently. We can now do that. And as our economy grows, we'll be able to maintain 4 lines permanently. But at the moment, it's a bit of a struggle to keep the kind of tax revenue, to keep our head above water, basically. We're able to cover all the state costs. We're able to cover the cost of the army and all this kind of thing. There's been no problems with it, but long term it could be tricky. And if we keep converting all of the diamonds that we have into state revenue, we'll incur inflation. Incidentally, the 1% inflation that we did have has dropped back off to 0, which is good. So we can afford a couple of percentage points. It's no big deal. That is pretty much it. I don't think there's anything else. The Chinese Civil War's over. I mentioned that. The Spanish-American War is raging, and Italy is having its arse handed to it. Again, by the Austrians. Nothing to worry about for us, I don't think. I mean, looking at Austrian military strength, it's nothing too serious. But Austria is militarily recovering. I don't think they're going to be able to maintain as big an army as they could before the war. They have 0 economy, basically, but remains to be seen. The only other area of economic development I didn't mention is we've opened up our first oil field in northern Iraq, in Mosul. We recently prospected this. It was done by a random event. It's not the only area we have access to petroleum. We also do, for example, in Kuwait. Now, it's not a petroleum-hungry economy just yet, but we do sell oil on our domestic market, or petroleum on our domestic market, a small amount of it. And that, again, it's just domestic market sales that we wouldn't have otherwise, so we're sort of exploiting that. But that has railroad access, incidentally, actually, and churns out 5 units per fortnight. So it's 5 units sold in the domestic market, probably as an industrial cleaner of sorts that we wouldn't have otherwise. That's pretty much it for the late October quarterly report. Next report then will either be in kind of December, so December, this year, or maybe January next year, but I'll probably do a kind of winter report, unless there's any kind of significant developments in the meantime. So, yeah, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.